This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. And for some of you listening to this, when I tell you what the topic is, um, I don't want you, turning off the podcast because um, I think it's going to be a very interesting topic. And I want to really know more about it. I mean, I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And when I hear the word psychedelic, um, I have all these ideas that go through my head. I don't know how real they are or not, but Ann Metz is with us today. And I met Ann through podmatch.com. And one of the things I saw in her bio was um, that she's a psychedelic therapist. So explain it to me, Ann, because, all I'm seeing right now are all these colors flashing in my face.
Well, it's interesting that you should bring up kind of, your generation and what psychedelics meant. Because I was, a young child in the 80s and grew up during the Reagan administration. And so my awareness of psychedelics was that, if you tried them, you would lose your mind and you would never come
Yeah.
back, which I think was part of the narrative in the 1960s. And so I think for a lot of us, when we hear psychedelics, there's a real reluctance to believe that there's anything that could be therapeutic about it. But the truth is that a lot of these substances, a lot of these medicines have long traditions and long histories of being used for psychological purposes, for spiritual purposes. And, I think that history has been to some extent erased. And we're starting to reclaim it now, and there's a lot more research going on. So I think that when we think about psychedelic therapy, it is certainly different than the way a lot of people are introduced to psychedelics. We focus a lot on the idea of the set and the setting, which is, set standing for the mindset and setting standing for kind of what the surroundings are like. And we try to be really intentional about that in psychedelic therapy, that we're there to learn something, we're there to grow, we're there to heal. Whereas psychedelics, I think, as they're often used in our culture, are for having a good time. They're
Right.
for escaping or something like that.
So what drew you into it? Because again, growing up in the 80s, um, you know, I think the message was still sort of the same in the 80s as it was in the 60s and 70s. Um, I grew up in a way that I knew if I even got close to the scene of anything psychedelic, my parents were going to kill me before I got killed. Um, and so I feared a lot of it, but we did see it in movies. We heard it being talked about all the time. If you went to a concert, uh, you saw it happening on stage, even though you
Hmm.
wanted to believe, oh no, they're just acting. No, they weren't just acting. Um, so by the 80s, many people were just, hey, that's old stuff already. But yet here we are in 2023, and that's your specialty.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I was probably a little bit more experimental than I should have been when I was in college. And so my first experience with psychedelics was just, I was hanging out with some friends and we were going for a hike and we had mushrooms, and it wasn't a wonderful experience. It was certainly interesting, but I didn't think too much of it until, of course, 2019, Michael Pollan's book came out, How to Change Your Mind. And, um, you know, I actually listened to it on an audiobook when I was on a very long road trip. And it was just really eye-opening. I mean, I had been working as a psychotherapist for, almost a decade at that point, and really had kind of gotten burned out with what the options were in terms of technology for supporting psychotherapy. We have traditional psychiatric medications, and sometimes they were helpful, sometimes they created more problems. And I had kind of just thought, oh man, there's just really nothing that's going to be able to, help people work through experiences that are hard to talk about. And I think that's really kind of one of the ways in which psychedelics are really helpful. So that book changed my mind a little bit. And on this trip, I happened to bump into someone with I make a joke, that mustache and a surfboard, and he had some psilocybin. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to try this and I'm going to see what this is like. And, I had this very profound personal experience with psilocybin, where my life was kind of falling apart at the time, and I didn't really think I'd find a way out of it. And I got this message late in the middle of the night that I could change my life. I didn't have to wait for it to just get better. And it took me a while to execute those instructions, but over the course of the next 9 months, working with my own therapist and talking about that experience, I started to really make some big changes. And I think that was really the starting point for me of some deep, long-standing healing that I really am grateful was able to have. And, why I hope that more people will be able to take advantage of this in coming years.
So the psychedelics that you're talking about, um, is there some sort of control that is provided for the patient or client?
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of one of the things that's really wonderful and very special about psychedelic therapy is that you are there. And if you are the person participating, you're, lying on a couch, perhaps you have an eye mask, you're listening to music, and you have someone who is there, who is present, who is monitoring you, who is ensuring that nothing bad is going to happen, and is also kind of attending to your needs. So there is this lovely piece of almost, I would say, mothering that is a part of the process, that I think for a lot of clients, maybe they don't expect that to be part of it, but we have snacks and cozy blankets, and that can be really profoundly transformational, particularly for people who have perhaps had developmental traumas or traumas around their early childhood and caregivers. So it is a very safe context. And, we talk for weeks about what this is going to be like to make sure that people are prepared, that any fears that they have, that we've really talked through. And so you kind of go into it, with as much preparation as you could have for it's not like you can really control where the experience goes, but we at least have done our due diligence and our legwork.
But you are a trained therapist,
Mhm.
correct? Okay.
That's correct. Yeah.
So I understand that there are some individuals who are psychedelic coaches. Is there a big difference in the training? I mean, I'm a coach and I definitely couldn't go there because I don't have enough information. Okay.
Yeah.
So I would think that's a little bit different.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a role for both coaches and psychedelic therapists going forward, particularly as more states start to decriminalize psychedelics. For me, I think the big difference is that a psychedelic coach can kind of help you meet your goal. If your goal is, you want to be sort of more creative and you want to use psychedelics, how can you do that? I think a psychedelic coach can be really helpful. Why I think psychedelic therapy with a psychedelic therapist is different is that we're able to really look at the root of problems, painful childhood experiences, things that maybe you've held in that you've even forgotten. So a lot of the kind of deeper work of the integration process, that's really what we talk about, I think is where you can really benefit from having a trained psychotherapist there. So I think it just depends on what people are out there looking for.
And I'm glad you gave that explanation because, we've had a lot of conversations about, uh, what is better for me, therapy or coaching? And you basically spelled it out. If there's something deeply rooted inside you that you haven't worked on, it's going to stay there until you get it out.
Yeah.
And most of us as coaches, we're not trained for that deep rooted feeling. We may have experienced it ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we have that ability, to help an individual. Uh, And you're right. I think as coaching, we are looking at how to take that step to keep moving forward. And we aren't really looking backwards. I remember my first introduction to psychedelics. I went to visit my brother, and I
Hmm.
hope he's listening to this. Um, he lived in this big house, and lots of people lived in this house. It was 1968 or 69.
Mm.
And I flew in especially to see him. And when I walked in the door, somebody handed me a joint. And I was this good little girl. It was like, oh, I'm no, no, no. And uh, my brother got mad at me because, hey, they're just trying
Aw.
to be friendly, like try it, sis. And I tried it, wasn't really sure what it did for me, never wanted to try it again. However, prior to me going through my divorce, my husband at the time decided that I had to loosen up. And
Mm.
so he invited somebody over and, uh, you know, Karen, you're going to partake in marijuana no matter what. Well, I was forced into it. At least that's how I felt.
Mm.
And I became paranoid about it.
Mm.
And so I've had this fear
Mhm.
about medic drugs. So
Mhm.
talk to me about how you know what is the right psychedelic to use and not to have the person, be laid out on your couch for days.
Yeah, gosh, well, that's a good question. I think there are kind of two pieces to this. The first piece is sort of the legality. And right now, ketamine, which is what we would call, an atypical psychedelic, it's a non-traditional one, is the only legalized psychedelic that is available for people.
Okay.
Uh, People expect that in the next year, MDMA will also be legalized for PTSD, and eventually, probably psilocybin will be legalized. So that's kind of the piece of it. Like, I have a license. I want to keep my license.
Right.
So I want to keep things above board in terms of my, in terms of my clinical work. Personally, what I do on my own time,
Hey,
is another
nobody's asking
question.
about that.
But the other part of it is, I think, and what's so interesting and exciting about psychedelic work is that part of the experience of integration is connecting with this idea of this inner healer. And that I, as the therapist, don't necessarily know what someone needs, but deep down inside every person, I believe they have what they need to heal. And it's sometimes hard to hear that voice about what you need, but psychedelics can actually be helpful for getting in touch with that. And so, I think if someone came to me and said, I really want to have a, a psychedelic experience with mushrooms, I would say, I'm not able to do that, but I recognize this is important for you. Let me help you prepare, and let's talk through that and how you can get the most out of this experience, and sort of, try to at least support them and what they feel like would be most helpful.
And I appreciate that because you're at least giving somebody a roadmap and saying, if you do this and if you do it this way, you know, it it should it shouldn't harm you,
Mhm.
but you're also giving them the caveat that, if they go in a different direction, that may not be so wise. And I think that's what we all need anytime we want to try anything
Mhm.
different. Um, I remember many years ago, I I was I was sent to a therapist because I was going through depression.
Mm.
And when I got to the therapist, um, he was extremely strange. I have to say that. Um, and he kept asking me, am I only bottled up in my marriage? Because if I wasn't bottled up in my marriage, he could lead me to places that I could express myself. And I'm
Hmm.
sitting there going, And what does all this mean? And then he handed me a card. Okay. And I looked at the card and it says, join in with other couples. And I thought, this is not why I came to you. I'm
Oh my
depressed. You're
gosh.
depressing me more. Um,
Wow.
and I didn't do anything about it at first. Okay. I
Mhm.
just thought, he's not for me, whatever. I was sent to somebody else to deal with my depression, and they were absolutely wonderful because instead of telling me I was depressed or telling me I had to take medication, um, they just let me start talking. And all of
Mm.
a sudden I knew where I needed to be and needed to go. But at that session, I said something about this other person, and the comment was, "Did you report this other person?" And I said, "No, I just figured they weren't for me." And they said, "Well, do yourself a favor, be nice to the rest of the world and report the person," which I did.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and then I had to be a witness in a courtroom, which was not much fun for me. But
Wow.
the point I'm trying to get at is those of you who are listening, there are great therapists out there like Anne and other people like Anne who are, they have their degrees, they have their certifications, they're doing things the right way. And I'm assuming, Anne, that not every state right now could you practice psychedelic therapy, correct?
That's correct. And let me just say, Karen, that story is just horrible. And I am so, so sorry that someone, in a professional, with professional responsibilities like that did not abide by them. And I'm really, really like incredibly amazed that you had the courage to testify. And you're right, that was like doing the public a service, because probably not all people that he would send that to would feel like they've had enough power to say no. So it's
Well,
really important that you did that.
and I thank you for that. And with my husband, who is such a free thinker. In fact, when I brought it home, he wanted to laugh about it and say,
Mm,
"Hey, yeah, we both can go." And I said, "Are you serious?" He goes, "No." He
yeah.
said, "But," he said, "I'm trying to lighten it up for you." And that's why I think in the beginning I thought, you know what? I'm not going to say anything because um, maybe it's just my feelings. But
Mm,
as time went on and I found somebody who I could work with and I mentioned it, and they said, do yourself a favor
hmm.
because you don't want to run into his clone along the way. And
Yeah.
I thought about that and they were right. If he's getting away with that, somebody else is as well. And that's why I'm pointing out that, find out who your therapist is, find out the accreditation, find out what is allowed in your state. Um,
Mm.
even though Anne is talking about, psychedelic therapy, I'm not sure that it can be done in Ohio because not everything is legalized here at the point of, you can go to Michigan and it seems like everything is legalized. Whole
Yeah.
other story to go into. Um,
Sure. Well, if you want, I can talk a little bit about Ohio. That might be interesting for your listeners.
okay, sure.
Yeah. Just because Ohio doesn't have recreational cannabis, doesn't really mean that they don't have ketamine as a ketamine assisted psychotherapy and ketamine assisted treatment as an option. Ketamine itself is a Schedule 3 drug that's been approved by the FDA. It's probably one of the most frequently used medications, and has been used kind of off label for mental health, for treatment resistant depression for a really, really long time. And it's safe, it's pretty predictable. It does have some contraindications. Something called cystitis can be a problem. And we also have concerns around addiction as well, too, if someone has a history of substance abuse. So in Ohio, you can certainly obtain this treatment. The next one probably that's on board would be MDMA, if that is legalized, and that would be legalized federally. Yes, but you're right, some states are very different.
So I come in and we determine after talking for a while that, you know, this might help unlock some things that are really getting me down.
Mhm.
And I don't mean, you know, I'm just feeling sad today. No,
Mm.
getting me so that I'm really not as functional as I want to be. how do you know how much of the medication for me to take so that, and I'm assuming a session is about an hour, is it normal? When does it wear off and what's going to happen to me when I leave your office?
Oh, this is a great question. Maybe I'll just kind of talk you through the process of
Okay.
typically how it works. Typically if you're meeting someone for CAP, which we would call it, you would have a few sessions leading up where you would do what we would call preparation work. You would start to build rapport. You'd start to identify some areas in your life that you might want to focus on and do some work around. And at the same time, you would get a referral to a medical provider. So I am not a psychiatrist. I'm not an MD. I'm not capable of prescribing medications. And so I would refer you to a prescribing partner. And that prescribing partner would take a medical inventory and they would write a prescription for, well, there are actually a couple of options. There's a IV version of ketamine that you would do in office. There is an intramuscular shot in your arm. And then the third, which is what I use, is a sublingual lozenge, where people basically have a lozenge in their mouth that dissolves. And so on the day of the dosing session, we would kind of plan to be together for about 3 hours. We'd come in, we would talk about your intention, any anxiety that you're having. And then you would let the lozenge dissolve in your mouth, and it would last for, I would say, about an hour. And then, the kind of coming up time where you would start to feel more comfortable, all in is about 3 hours. And then after that, you'd want someone to make sure they can come pick you up, and then come back for some sessions to talk about the experience.
So basically, the medication, it's has a short lifespan, but we're being proactive and saying, look at, depending on what you ate, didn't eat, where you are at that moment in time, it may last longer. It may cut off a little sooner. So just as if I was going in to have minor surgery,
Mhm.
somebody's going to drive me home.
Yeah,
And that
yeah,
makes sense. That makes
yeah.
sense.
And kind of depending on how far you go in, and that again is dose dependent. We may be talking a little bit, or you may be totally silent and in your own head and in your own mind. So that kind of there's a real there's a real continuum of experiences that people can have.
So it sounds like how I used to be when they used to use sodium pentothal in the hospital when you had surgery. And I came out one time just talking about my ex-husband. I mean,
Uh,
every feeling came out. Um, and I remember when I woke up, because I don't remember doing it, but I was told I did. Um, they had a nurse and a social worker in my room waiting for me to wake
mm,
up.
wow.
And they asked me all these questions. It was like, well, how did you know about that? They said, well, guess what? This sometimes can bring that out. Um, is this drug as potent as something like that?
Well, interesting that you bring up the analogy of general anesthesia, because ketamine is actually one of the most commonly used drugs in general anesthesia. So you'll kind of have kind of a cocktail there. So it might kind of be a familiar experience, but again, it's totally dose dependent and also a little bit dependent on the delivery route. If you have shot in your arm, it is powerful and happens very quickly. A lozenge in your mouth is much more sort of slow and moderate, I would say.
So, what do you see the difference in when you use the psychedelic application compared to traditional psychotherapy?
Yes, that is such a good question. I think the metaphor that that works well for this is thinking about psychedelics as being a psychotherapy lubricant, that it makes it happen more smoothly, it makes it easier. And I think that particularly if you're doing deep trauma work, the brain is a very wise thing. We have survived in part because we have a tendency to change the subject when we're feeling anxious, or forget a memory, that we have all of these great defense mechanisms that sort of keep ourselves psychologically safe. And in traditional counseling and psychotherapy, those defense mechanisms can really get in the way of us being able to talk about the things we need to talk about. And so to some extent, you know, uh, s- psych, psychedelics are they help soften that ego defense structure so that people are able to process traumatic memories, difficult feelings that they maybe aren't comfortable naturally expressing to their therapist. So I would say that's really the big difference. And the other differences I think are, the time frame. It's obviously a much longer time frame. People are a lot more vulnerable when they're under the influence of a psychedelic. And so, to your point earlier about making sure that you're working with somebody who is licensed and is ethical, I think it's just that much more important. It's not like you can walk out the door on ketamine the same way that you can. So
Sure.
just really all the more important to make sure that you're working with somebody that is trustworthy, and that has your best interest at heart and will do no harm.
So even though this is discussed before that session and
Mhm.
you're getting the okay from the individual, um, has there ever been uh, an incident where when they've come out of it, they didn't realize they had talked about something that maybe they didn't want to talk about?
Yes. And I think that is common. It's also common for people to maybe remember things that they didn't want to remember. And to that, I would just sort of say, like, going back to the idea of the inner healer, is that things come out, they come up when you're ready to heal them.
Yeah.
And there's no wrong step that you can take. It's never really a mistake. And I think that's the other important part of really a good therapeutic relationship, is being able to talk about the process of it. Like, what was it like for you to know that you had said something to me? What is your fear that I might think? And really being able to kind of talk about that with a client can be really powerful.
So I'm assuming that, especially for individuals who are suffering from PTSD,
Hmm.
this may be a good type of therapy for some of them because it might be easier to get that trauma, lifted off their shoulders, out of their stomach, wherever they're holding it.
Hmm. Sure. And I think it's also great for depression, in the sense of, sometimes depression is really a very physical experience, where you're in physical pain that is also psychological. And the experience of ketamine is that it's a dissociative anesthetic. And so it is, a balm on the pain that people feel. And so I think one of the ways it can be really transformational for that is that it gives people an experience of something that is new, of a different way of being, and of being in their own bodies, and that can just sometimes be a real toehold for making progress and addressing that depression.
Absolutely. Well, you've answered a lot of my questions that I had. And now knowing the difference really between coaching in this manner and therapy in this manner, uh, there's a distinct difference. And I'm hoping our listeners really got that. Um, I know that my son, 2 years ago, uh, a situation had happened which a memory came back. He was initially embarrassed to tell us about it. Um, he started holding it in, and he was just getting angrier and angrier. And um, I finally just said to him, "You're either going to have to unload on us, or we're going to have to. You're going to have to find a therapist." And he was very lucky. He found a
Mm,
wonderful therapist. And my son doesn't trust people immediately, but almost trusted him immediately,
That's great.
and didn't use psychedelics, but used some form of hypnosis.
Mhm.
And I don't remember how my son explained it to me. He said, it's not like he threw a watch in front of me and said, watch the watch go back and forth. But it got him to actually tell where these feelings were coming from,
Mm.
and um, helped him tremendously. And then he was able to come to us and say, this is what happened. Um, and of course, mom feeling guilty. It had happened when he was still in high school. And it's like, oh my God, why didn't I know? Um, and so then I realized, you know what? It was a shock. And that's
Mm.
why I didn't know. And that's why he
Yeah.
held it in so long. So I encourage anybody out there, you know, therapy, coaching, whatever works for you. Uh, we only have one life to live, and let's live it to the best opportunity that we can. So you're in Oregon, correct?
No, I'm
No.
actually in New Mexico.
Oh,
And I
okay.
just love that you're saying that. I just, you don't have to be sick to get better. It's true.
Well, it's so many of us think we do.
Mhm.
Okay. So before you get sick, when you're starting to feel the symptoms, um, you need to reach out. You
Mhm.
need to, it starts with ourselves to admit, hey, I'm just not making what I need to make. I'm not
Yeah.
being who I want to be. Um, so you're in New Mexico,
Mhm.
beautiful country. I'm sure it's nice and warm there today, correct?
Well, it's actually pretty cold. I am in northern New Mexico, and
Okay.
so we're about 7,000 feet. So, you know, pretty high. It's been pretty chilly, but I think that's, part of one of the things I really like about doing this work in this place is that it is, a really spiritually rich place that I think people have historically come to heal. And so I feel really lucky to be part of that tradition.
That is wonderful. So tell my listeners how they can find you, and then we'll also put it in the show notes.
Sure. Yes. Well, I am really here to help people who want to do psychedelic psychotherapy or just kind of want to use psychedelics safely on their own. So the easiest way to find me is the website nobadtrips.com. And you can sign up for my mailing list there and get more helpful things. And then my professional website is Ann with an E, Metz, METZ.com. So thanks so much.
We'll make sure that's all in. And thank you so much for educating all of us, especially myself. Now I know. And I like the fact that you're also providing education for anyone who wants to use this socially, recreationally. And so for those of us who live in states where we may have recreational drugs now, let's be safe.
Mhm.
Just don't go to the dispensary and say, oh, I want 2 of those and 3 of those. Know what you're doing.
Yeah, and get something out of your experience. I mean, they can be really helpful if you're thoughtful and intentional about it. And that's my hope.
All right. Well, thanks again, and we will talk to you again soon. Have a
Thanks,
great day,
Karen.
Anne. Bye bye now.
Bye.